glad to see each of you on this Lord's Day. Thankful for our presence. Thankful for Farron and Sanders. Good news relative to Sanders' test. And glad for the rain. We needed that, haven't we? In our readings that we have, chapters 4 through 9 of Mark, Mark, we want to remember, primarily emphasizes Jesus' what? His power, his miracles, his works. And in chapter 4 is Mark's account, really, of Jesus giving what? Parables. Similar to Luke 8 and Matthew, the 13th chapter. And then our miracles continue. He heals or cast out two men who had what? Demons, demon-possessed. And then we have a resurrection. Who is it? Jairus' daughter. And then in chapter 6, we have the sending forth of 12 on the limited commission. And then in chapter 7, we have Jesus. Well, there's one thing I want to mention. In chapter 6, in verse 30, they told him all things whatsoever you've done, taught, and he said, come apart to a desert place and rest a while. That's really Mark's account of the beginning of what phase of Jesus' ministry. That's right, his retirement. And he goes through different areas. Jews from Jerusalem come and argue with him about the disciples not washing their hands ceremonially before they ate bread. And Jesus deals with that. And then the Syrophoenician woman's daughter is healed. And all that indicates that Jesus was interested not just in who? Jews, but others as well. And then in chapter 8, we have the feeding of how many? 4,000. The 4,000. 5,000 came first, and the 4,000 were fed. And even after the feeding of the 4,000, Pharisees are clamoring for what? Verse 11 of chapter 8. More signs, a sign from heaven. And he reprimands them for that. And then he states that he is going to have to go to Jerusalem. This is 8:31, corresponds to Matthew 16:21. And be rejected by the elders, the chief priests and scribes, and then be killed, and then the third day be raised. This is the first time that he deals with the specifics, where it will be, by whom it will be, and the very fact that he will die and be raised, that he speaks. Now, he's alluded to that in several instances, but this is the first time where he actually deals with it in a specific way. And after that, he takes Peter, James, and John up into a mountain in chapter 9, and what happens? Transfiguration. That's right. And then coming, and we made a point, without belaboring it, that here he's going to have to die and then be raised. And this hit the apostles hard. In fact, Peter said, Lord, these things will never happen to you. And then he rebukes Peter. But then when Peter, James, and John are able to see the glorified Christ in this transfigured way, then it would give them faith, give him courage, certainly, and give all of us faith that though he had to go through this, yet he was still God's Son. The second time where a voice from heaven said, this is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased, that part was said at his baptism. But now he appends to it, hear ye him. And because Peter said it's good for us to be here. Let us make what? Three tabernacles. One for Moses, one for Elijah, and one for you. And it didn't matter how you weighed the scales. If you elevated Moses and Elijah to a plane with Jesus, or de-escalated Jesus down to on the plane with Moses and Elijah, Jesus is the one to be heard now, and his authority respected over all of God's spokesmen before time. It's been stated, and I think it's probably true, that likely Moses would have represented the Jewish law, and Elijah all the prophets. And since you've got the combination of the law and the prophets as really composing in a nutshell or summary all the Old Testament, and then Jesus is shown to be the one to be heard now. Coming down, they cure a man who had a boy who was a what? Coming down from the mount.
Had an unclean spirit.
Yeah, had an unclean spirit, and he was epileptic, and so it goes on, and then we'll stop with that in chapter 9. All right, comment or question? Anybody? All right, let's move on to Acts, the 18th chapter. We come to what city in the second journey? Corinth, yes. If you didn't get that question right, where can we send you? Where can we put you? Time out, yeah. Back in the control, where was the cry room. No, we're in Corinth, second journey. And here's the second journey. All three journeys begin at what city? Antioch of Syria. And so Paul passes through this region, and second journey picks up Timothy in Lystra, Luke in Troas. Oh, by the way, he starts off with Silas. So Paul, Silas, Timothy, Luke, and then we got the conversion of the Philippian, Lydia, as well as the jailer. We come on through Thessalonica and Berea, then down to Corinth. We'll say more about that in just a moment. But we read through these sections, and we talked about Aquila and Priscilla last Wednesday. But I want to come here. Well, we haven't answered our questions. We read in Acts 18 the whole first 17 verses, and actually down to the halfway through verse 18, where Paul tarries there many days. And we'd gotten down on page 34 to verses 5 through 11. Let's kind of refresh our minds. 1 through 4, Paul is with Aquila and Priscilla and teaches every Sabbath day where? In the synagogue. But, verse 5, when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul was constrained by the word. The New American Standard says, devoted himself continually to the word, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. And we made the point that they brought what for Paul so he could do that? Money, yeah, support from the churches in Macedonia. And that would have included Philippi and then likely Thessalonica. Because at Corinth, we went through this on Sunday night, 1 Corinthians 9, he said, I was at no charge. I preached the gospel to you for nothing. And yet in 2 Corinthians 11, he says that I robbed other churches, taking wages of them, that I might not be in charge of you. So he's alluding to what's happening in Acts 18:5, that Silas and Timothy bring help, and that gives him opportunity to devote himself continually. Well, as a result of that, hostility mounted. They opposed themselves and blasphemed. In verse 6, he shook out his raiment and said, we're going to go to the Gentiles, which is common practice. And so they departed and began meeting in the house of whom? Titus Justus, one who worshiped God, whose house joined hard to the synagogue. And then verse 8 is a memory verse. Crispus, who was what? The ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all of his house. And many of the Corinthians hearing did what? Believed and were baptized. Yes. And then 9 and 10 indicate that Paul still was somewhat fearful of the area and what might happen to him. And the Lord basically said, what? Don't be. Everything's going to be okay. So he dwells there a year and a half. And then in 12 through 17 that we finished up with on Wednesday night, when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, which is Greece, Jews with one accord took Paul and brought him before the judgment seat, the bema. We had pictures of that, saying, this man persuades men to worship God contrary to the law. But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio interrupted. And he says, if this were a matter of wrong or wicked villainy, the American Standard says malice, forethought, all kinds of problems, I'd listen to you. But if there are questions about words and names in your own law, deal with that yourself. I'm not minded to be matters of this. So he drove them from the judgment seat, and then they, in the King James and New King James say, don't say they, it says the what? Y'all, we talked about that, Patty? The Greeks. Yeah, the Greeks took hold of Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, beat him before the judgment seat, and Gallio cared for none of these things. I have a note that in the book, it's not right there, but if you look over on page 39, I did have something on that, and I probably will change it. We talked a little bit about who were the they, because some of you have the New King James that says the Greeks, and then most of the other received texts that the King James and New King James use have the Greeks. All of the other newer translations have they. And grammatically, the they would point back to the Jews who brought Paul before Gallio. However, having said that, the word they could be used as more of just the crowd at large. In fact, I went back through a number of sources that I've had, and this is one of the first ones I had, Brother Bowles on Acts. I cut my teeth on this one, and he said the Greeks then laid hold on Sosthenes, who was the ruler of the synagogue. They beat him in the presence of Gallio, and Gallio gave no attention to it. Then he talked about Gallio a little bit. Then he says this: it has been a question of much dispute as to why he was beaten by the Greeks. Some have speculated in regard to this, that Sosthenes, being the leader, was defeated in his case before Gallio, and hence needed to be punished for bringing such trivial charges. Some claim that it is not clear as to who beat Sosthenes, whether it was the infuriated Jews or whether the Gentiles. However, it seems clear that the Gentiles so punished Sosthenes. He mentions that, and Brother McGarvey goes into a lengthy footnote on the fact that, again, the grammar would point back the pronoun they to its antecedent, which would be the Jews. And yet, he comes to the same conclusion, really, that it would be the Greeks. And so, the difference in the manuscripts is such that it's thought that some just, that's what it was, and so they put it in there. Now, what's the main point of all this? Since it's almost impossible to tell, the main takeaway from all this is that what happened to Sosthenes? He got beat. Yeah, now, regardless of who did it, Sosthenes was beaten. And another thing on this, you'll find different opinions on if this is the same Sosthenes who was mentioned in 1 Corinthians 1 in the salutation. Paul, an apostle, Paul called to be an apostle of Christ Jesus, and Sosthenes, our brother, unto the church of God, which is at Corinth. That some say, well, you can't tell if it was the same one, that was a common name. Yeah, that's true. However, it's interesting that Luke records him here in Acts 18, and Paul mentions him specifically in 1 Corinthians 1, as if all those people knew who he was. With that being the case, I don't think he's just somebody out of the blue. So to me, it would be more likely to believe that he was one and the same person, and that the Sosthenes here in Luke 18, verse 16 and 17 would have been the one who likely took the position that Crispus vacated upon his obedience to the gospel. He's beaten, but then in time, by the time Paul on the third journey writes the 1 Corinthian letter, he's obeyed the gospel. That seems to be, to me, the most likely. What do you think, Charlie? You look like you...
I would think so. He used to mention the same name several times, so it's got to be something they knew.
Yeah, there's several James in the New Testament. There's more than one John. There's some that just like with us. But in that context, it would seem that they knew who he was. So the main point, I think, is that here hostility among the Jews was, and then even the hatred among the Greeks toward the Jews, that they were willing to stir up problems and ended up having Sosthenes beaten. That was about all I had on that. Yes, sir. I'm sorry, yes, sir.
The fact that Galileo took no notice of those beatings
Yeah.
probably has some clue as to who that was.
Yeah, it's like he took a blind eye.
Since then, I think that means probably
That
the Greeks did it.
Could have been. That's what some think, that
Just don't pick another group.
he turned a blind eye as if this guy Sosthenes is getting what he deserves, but I can't actually, from a civil point of view, do that, so I'm just going to kind of let it go.
Yeah.
That seems to be the idea. All right, let's answer some of our questions, and I want to go ahead. You'll notice in your booklet here on page 34 down toward the bottom, Silas and Timothy arrive and many Corinthians are converted. That takes us back to where we were. And then if you'll notice turn your page to 36, then we have the writing of 1 Thessalonians and then 2 Thessalonians. And then if you pick up on page 39, we resume the narrative of Paul before Gallio, because it may seem that that this was sometime toward the end of Paul's stay, and then when Luke records that he was there for a year and 6 months, that's in verse 11, Acts 18:11, and then the situation with Gallio and Paul and Sosthenes being beaten likely happened a little bit after the writing of these letters. That seems to be the best we can do, at least. All right, let's finish answering our questions, and I'd like for us to kind of glance at 1 Thessalonians. After Silas and Timothy arrived, this is number 8, Paul was constrained by the word, or began devoting himself completely to the word, the New American Standard says, testifying to Jews that Jesus was the Christ. Considering the passages listed in the previous question, number 7, how would Paul then be able to devote himself completely to the word? Well, we've already mentioned it, brought money, brought support to Paul. After their arrival, this also provided the occasion for Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians. Compare Acts 18:5 with Acts 17:15 and 16, and 1 Thessalonians 3:1 through 10, especially verse 6. Be able to tell what happened to Timothy, Silas, and Paul's feelings for the church at Thessalonica. Who wants to answer that? Okay, Kay, what about it?
I put their love and concerns for them grew stronger, and their mission was to continue strengthening them in faith.
Okay, good.
That wasn't the right answer.
No, you hit around a whole lot that is right. Timothy came to Paul when Paul was where? Well, that's true, but in 1 Thessalonians 3, Paul was still at Athens. Okay, let's turn over 1 Thessalonians 3. Get all this in mind. You really, I say you, all of us really need to have the facts just cemented in our minds where we can just spill them out in our own words in order to get something. By the way, what we're doing right at this moment, I have observed, has been one of the more difficult things for people who've been Christians for some time to try to put all together. It's not that anybody is dumb, it's just you're taking a lot of facts from about 3 different sources, 3 different books. You're putting them together and trying to reconstruct Paul's journeys, and that's what you do. And sometimes that's seldom done. Look at 1 Thessalonians 3. Read with me, beginning in verse 1. Wherefore, he's been talking about his work among them. So, therefore, or wherefore, when we could no longer forbear, we thought it good to be left behind at Athens. And he said, sent Timothy our brother. That means that Timothy had to do what? He had to come to Paul where? At Athens. Okay? And so, I was going to be left alone. We sent Timothy our brother, God's minister in the gospel of Christ, to establish you, or you may say to encourage you, and to comfort you concerning your faith, that no man be moved by these afflictions. For yourselves know that hereunto we were appointed. Remember the afflictions? Jews stirred up. They took vile men of the baser sort, assaulted whose house? Jason, there in Acts 17. For verily, when we were with you, we told you beforehand that we are to suffer affliction, even as it came to pass, and ye know. For this cause I also, when I could no longer forbear, I just couldn't stand it any longer. And this comes back to exactly what you were saying, Kay. He was concerned, his love for them and all that. He said, for this cause I, when I could no longer forbear, sent that I might know your faith. That is, I sent Timothy to you, lest by any means the tempter had tempted you, and our labor should be in vain. Now, here's a key. But when Timothy came, even now, so whenever Timothy comes, it's very, very shortly after he arrives that Paul does what? Writes 1 Thessalonians. Okay. So when Timothy came, even now unto us from you, and brought us glad tidings of your faith and love, and that ye have good remembrance of us always, longing to see us, even as we also to see you. For this cause, brethren, we were comforted over you in all our distress and affliction through your faith. For now we live, if ye stand fast in the Lord. Now, that's very significant insofar as reconstructing. Now, obviously, that's not the only reason Paul said those words, so we can, 2,000 years later, we can reconstruct who came to him where. The point is the great concern he had for these brethren. But it does give us a glimpse, a light, so to speak, as to what happened back here in Acts 17 and 18. So let's go back now real quickly to Acts 17. Acts 17, you're thinking, Owens has got it wrong. He means 18. No, I mean 17. Acts 17. All right, Paul first, in the first part of the chapter, comes to where we were just talking. Thessalonica. The Jews stir up problems, and then look in verse 10. The brethren immediately sent away Paul and Silas. So evidently Timothy stayed in Thessalonica for a while. Well, you keep going down in verse 14. Then immediately the brethren sent forth Paul to go as far as to the sea, and Silas and Timothy abode there still. That's in Berea. That means that Paul and Silas went to Berea, but then at some point in Berea, who came? Timothy came. All right. Then look at 15. But they that conducted Paul brought him as far as Athens, and receiving a commandment unto Silas and Timothy that they should come to him with all speed, they departed. All right. The rest of Acts 17 deals with Paul where? At Athens. But you go back to 1 Thessalonians 3, who came to Timothy while he was in Athens. I'm sorry, I just told you the answer. Who came to Paul when he was... Timothy came to Paul. But he was so worried about the church at Thessalonica that he did what? Sent Timothy back. Meantime, Paul leaves Athens and goes over to chapter 18 of Acts, Corinth. And he's there with Aquila and Priscilla. And then in Acts 18:5, who comes? Silas and Timothy. You go back to 1 Thessalonians 3, and then we find that after Timothy brought that good report, then what does Paul do? He writes a letter. All right, now on the map, this is evidently how it looked. Paul wanted to go up into Bithynia and Mysia, the Spirit forbade him. So he goes to Troas, Philippi, Thessalonica, and we remember the problems. There was a Jewish element, but there was also idolatry that he deals with in 1 Thessalonians 1. Immorality was rampant. Idleness was common. We don't read that in Acts 17, except there were vile fellows of the baser sort, or the lewd fellows that were basically just, ne'er-do-wells and just looking for problems. And then the philosophy of death ended it all. And we see some of that. But Paul preached the gospel. The mob attacked the residence of Jason, and a peace bond was taken. And then Paul goes on to Berea from Thessalonica here, and then on down to Athens. But when he's at Berea and he comes down to Athens, he says, send Silas and Timothy to me with all speed. So he goes to Athens, and who comes to Athens? 1 Thessalonians 3? Timothy. All right, Timothy arrives in Athens. But Paul is so concerned about the Thessalonians, it leads him to send Timothy back to them. So he does. All right, we're thinking end of Acts 17. Acts 18, Paul goes over to Corinth. And then he's there with Aquila and Priscilla. And then who come down from Macedonia? Timothy and Silas. Both of them come down. And so they rejoin Paul in Corinth. Those are the passages that deal with it. And then according to 1 Thessalonians 3, Timothy brings a good report of the Thessalonians, how they were hanging in there, even among severe persecution. And so that's the occasion of Paul writing 1 Thessalonians. And it's interesting that in the very salutation of 1 Thessalonians, he mentions Silas and Timothy. They were with him. And the Thessalonians would have known them well. Timothy would have stayed there a little longer after. So you put all that together, and what it does, my friends, is this. If you have been, or maybe are, I'm not asking for a show of hands, when I started getting serious about the Bible, I would kind of read through the salutation. Well, let's get to the heart of the matter and go on. But a lot is implied in the salutation. In other words, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word is significant. And even in the salutations, there are things that applied certainly to the initial readers, but they're for us. They help us to reconstruct and to get a fullness of our appreciation of what they were going through and what the attitudes of Paul and Silas and Timothy were, and how we ought to be the same as well.
Philip.
Yes, sir.
In these places, at Berea and Thessalonica, it seems that Paul is the one that's really persecuted. They drive him out, because Timothy and Silas stayed there.
Yeah.
Why? Is it because Paul was the one doing the preaching?
Well, a couple of answers. I believe that's possibly, maybe majority right, that he was leading the way in the preaching. And if they thought they could get the leader out of the way, maybe the others would follow suit. But also, it's possible that the others were persecuted to a degree it's just not recorded. I have thought oftentimes, what happened to Bartholomew? We just don't have any record of it. We had mostly Peter, James, and John in those first several chapters of Acts. And then Peter Philip in Acts 8. A little bit more Peter in chapter 9, Peter in 10, and then really it shifts to Paul. Well, what about Andrew, James, and John? Well, Philip, Thomas, Matthew, what about all those fellows? They were still going, and it's likely that they received some, but probably not maybe the majority. It is stated, Paul, the Lord told Paul that I will show you how many things you'll suffer for my name's sake. Not that God wanted that to happen, but given the nature of Paul, and it's like Lee and I were talking about somebody the other day, it's like when the Lord said, Paul sickled, like a dog sickled. And it's not he'd do it with love, but he was after them knowing the gospel and turning from darkness to light, from the power of Satan unto God, is in the 26th chapter, the Lord's commission says. Yeah.
And Paul would have been no less zealous in the preaching of the gospel than he was in persecuting them for the Sanhedrin.
Yes, yeah.
And, another
going all the way to Damascus.
Yeah, another thing about this, it seems to me, by the time he got to Athens, it had been no more than about 3 months.
Possibly so.
And so, word got back and forth pretty good. Didn't
yes,
it?
yeah. It sure did between the Thessalonian Jews and
you're talking about from Philippi to Athens is what, 200 miles?
Yeah, something like that.
And you can get a boat, but I didn't get that. He went by water to Athens from Berea.
Yeah,
is what I get. And,
yes,
but there's a lot of communication. It sounds like there's a lot of feet on the road to me.
Yes. That is one thing that I remember reading years ago in Baker's Bible Atlas, and it's been in other places, that when you think about that passage in Galatians 4, when the fullness of the times came, the Roman roads, one thing that made the access to various cities and the spread of the gospel more quickly, that's one thing. But the Persians had developed a pretty good postal system. and incorporated by the Romans. And so the letter carrying was common during that time. A mail system was common. And of course, the Greek language had permeated the Mediterranean world, and that enabled them to basically speak with one tongue. And that facilitated the spread and the rapid spread of the gospel as well. Made the point, Gibbons, in his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, chapter 15, has 5 points that he makes as to why the rapid spread of the gospel during the first century, rapid progress of the church in the first century. It's worth reading. You can find it online. It's, what do you call that? Public domain now. You had a hand up, I
The
thought.
reason I had asked that question, I remember when Peter, when they arrested Christ in the garden, Peter, they said, you're one, no, I'm not
Yeah.
a part of this group.
Yeah.
And yet here, it seems that everyone knows that Silas Timothy is with that group.
Yes.
I just didn't understand why they would want to beat Paul, and then he left Silas and Timothy there, or sent Timothy back, the young man by himself, to speak to the church there.
Yeah, you're right. In Philippi, they beat both Paul and Silas.
Yeah.
And both of them were fastened, had their feet fastened in stocks. Yeah. Okay, good question. Good comment. All right. I kept looking at the clock. I said, wow, I'm doing so great. It's just 9:35. And then I thought, well, that can't be right. We've already... the battery must have stopped. It's 5 after 10. Reminds me of the... yeah, I won't say. Yeah, I'll tell you. The kind of a preacher joke. The fellow said that he always put a cough drop in his mouth before he began to preach, and then when it finally dissolved, he knew it was time to preach. And one day he just kept preaching. He said, well, my wife had substituted a button for a cough drop. It never dissolved. Oh, okay. So let's see. We answered 9. Number 10. As Paul continued pressing the gospel, a breach developed. Describe what happened. Well, they opposed and blasphemed Paul. And he spoke out and said, your blood be upon your own hand. I am free. From henceforth we'll go to the Gentiles. All right. And then they started meeting in the home of Titus Justus. I'll just say this in passing. That, Paul did not, even in Athens, in Ephesus, in Acts 19, they separated the disciples to the school of Tyrannus and met there for a while. I have heard some brethren who, in hearing about things that happened back in the 50s and the 60s relative to the institutional problems and how brethren, were kind of at odds one with another, and a lot of brethren lost Billy and Benny Lovell built some buildings, church buildings in Limestone County. And with members who didn't want to go along with the church sending money to various orphans' homes, they were run out of the very buildings that they had helped lay the foundation for. And free labor. And the brethren were doing all that. And I have heard, and then they'd go to establish a congregation somewhere else. And I've heard younger brethren kind of bemoan the fact that, those brethren should have just gotten along. And they're looking at it from, 60, 70 years removed, looking down on these brethren who were in the thick of things as if, they should have just all stayed together. Well, you have an apostolic precedent. There are sometimes occasions. In fact, in 1 Corinthians 11, Paul said, there must come what?
Falling away.
Divisions or contentions, that they that are approved may be made manifest among you. And so sometimes when you have, especially if you have a majority of brethren who are, they're set in concrete, they're not moving on something, and there's a matter of truth and righteousness. I'm not saying people ought to divide at the drop of a pen, but when they're unmovable and there's a matter of right at stake, then you have to go and go where you can worship and work with the Lord in His cause effectively and conscientiously. Does that make sense to everybody? So don't let some of these young whippersnappers who think, well, you know, I'm above all that. I've done things differently. I got along with it. Well, you didn't live through it. And people sometimes look through almost in a condescending way, and they don't realize what was going on during that time. Okay, number 11, top of 35. What is the meaning of Paul's symbolic action mentioned in verse 6 when he shook out his raiment? Matthew 10 and Ezekiel 3 can help. Basically, he said what? We're doing what?
They taught the truth.
Taught the truth, you won't take it, so we're leaving, yes, left them to themselves. What is notable about the conversion of Crispus given the circumstances? Well, he was a what among the Jews? He was a ruler, a leader among them, and so the gospel was influencing him. It's reminiscent of Acts 6, verse 7, that the word of God increased daily, and a great company of the priests were obedient to the faith. That was significant, that the priests, because usually the priests were not the Pharisee party, but the Sadducees. And to get them to understand what the gospel is all was, that was huge. All right, and I'm sure you read the note. Number 13, compare the summary description of the conversion of the Corinthians with other conversions we've studied. What are the similarities? Everybody has to do what? Hear the gospel and believe it, confess, repent of their sins, and be baptized. And we don't see it in Acts 18, but 1 Corinthians 6 says in verse 9 that y'all have heard quoted all your lives, don't you know that the unrighteous shall not inherit the kingdom of God, or neither fornicators or adulterers or effeminate or seditionists, whatever, all these things shall not inherit. And such were what? Some of you. But you were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified in the Spirit of God. So he makes the point that they changed. Well, implied in a change is you've got to, the R word, you got to repent. So while it's not stated in so many words, that's what happened when you read the letter. Okay? Let's see. We just answered 14. State the kinds of sinners the power of the gospel was able to change. Well, the unrighteous shall not inherit, and then he listed some of who those unrighteous are. Who? Fornicators, what else? Idolaters, adulterers, homosexuals, catamites, or abusers of themselves with men, or sodomites, and who else? Thieves, covetous, drunkards, revilers, and extortioners. All kinds of people. If you sat down on the bench with one of them in services, you might want to put your hands in your pockets. I love you, brother, but I need to keep my hands in my pocket. But no, they changed, which indicates some of those sins are sexual sins, catamounts, the sodomites, or as the older translations say, effeminate. People say, well, I'm just born that way. Even if a person is born with a proclivity or an attraction for, like some are born and they get on up and I just got to have a drink. Or some get a kick out of lying to people. But that shows what? Even if you have certain weaknesses, you can what? You can change. You can basically say, as Nancy Reagan said years ago, say no to drugs. Just say no, don't do it. And develop that willpower that you have to have, and that's a whole different kind of a lesson. But develop the reasons as to why you want to say no, why you don't want to do that, if possible.
You know, we like to classify sins.
Yeah.
And some of these that are listed are what we would consider some of the worst.
Yes.
But that's not the case, because there's others that are listed here. You know, you have those sexual sins, what in today's time we consider, extremely bad. But then you've got somebody who's an extortioner or something like that. So you've got these different things that we need to realize that sin is sin.
Yes. Even covetous.
Yes.
How many people do I know that are covetous? Well, it's hard to tell. But those are, good point. That's exactly right, Lynn. All right, good. Years later, Paul would write back to the Corinthians and describe his feelings when he was first among them, 1 Corinthians 2. Considering the general morals of Corinth, why might Paul have felt as he did? Well, there was a whole lot of what going on there? So a whole lot of wickedness and confidence in human wisdom. And so he said, I was with you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. Likely those feelings were the cause of the Lord's words to Paul in a vision. List 3 things the Lord told Paul which would have encouraged him to continue preaching. Well, he first said, I am what? I'm with you. Second, no man shall harm you. And third, I've much people in the city. So, I'm not left you. Paul, of course, the Lord was with Paul even when he was stoned at Lystra. He was still with him. When the Lord says, lo, I am with you, does that mean you're always going to be prosperous and healthy? No. But there is an agreement and providential help, and the fact that I know my relation with the Lord is still there. And if I call on him as Father, he knows. But sometimes people think, well, I'm with you. That means all these good things are going to happen. Nothing bad ever happens. That's not the case. How does the phrase, for I have much people in this city, relate to John 10:16? John 10, other sheep I have which are not of this fold. And of whom did he speak? Gentiles. And so it's spoken of we would say, in promise, in prospect, that they were his people. That does not mean God had arbitrarily assigned a definite number whom he had selected to be saved, but given certain attitudes that God knew were among people at Corinth, he could foresee that many would be converted under his preaching. How long did Paul remain at Corinth? At least this long, a year and a half. In whose house did he remain while he worked in Corinth? Titus Justus, likely a Gentile proselyte similar to those mentioned in chapter 13. Now on the next page, we got about a minute. The overview of the Thessalonians. Here's what I want to do with you. I want to go through some slides. You read that, and Lord willing, Wednesday night we'll go ahead and get kicked off with 1 Thessalonians. But it's the first recorded letter Paul wrote, obviously from Corinth on the second journey. And if you read all 5 chapters in one sitting, I think you would come likely to the same conclusion I have, that he's thankful. The sense of thanksgiving permeates the letter. He's thankful for their faithfulness among persecution. That's mentioned several times. But then at the end of each chapter, in the beginning of chapter 5 and the end of chapter 5, he mentions the second coming of Christ. And that is the impetus to drive them into maintaining their holiness. The time is somewhere around this age, 51 to 2. Some key verses are here in their growing and sanctifying. Well, let's look at it. Look at 1 Thessalonians 3, 12 and 13. Did I say Corinthians? I meant Thessalonians. 1 Thessalonians 3. I think this is a key considering the reading of the whole letter. Paul said that the Lord make it increase and abound in love one toward another, toward all men. That'd be hard given their circumstances among the Jews there. To the end, he may establish your hearts, unblameable in holiness, before our God and Father at the coming of our Lord Jesus with all his saints. I want to confirm you and for you to be established solidly and grow on in the Lord, looking toward what? The coming of the day of Christ, right? And so those are key ideas. The historical part of it, in 1 through 3 of the chapters that come into their faith in spite of persecution, talks about his preaching among them. And then the fact that they ought to live holy lives in light of Jesus' second coming in chapters 4 and 5. And then the chapter contents that we have following. Another thing, the church has survived and grown. Those passages indicate that. Paul deals with his experiences in Philippi in the first part of 2. His preaching, the nature of his preaching at Thessalonica, his work among them. The mob action is alluded to, and then peace bond is taken. And he said, many obstacles, Satan has hindered me. And then he mentions what we read a while ago, how he was so concerned about them that he was willing to be left in Athens alone and sent Timothy to them that he might know their state. And then references to all their idolatry, their immorality, especially in chapter 4, how idleness was common. He encouraged them in the, especially in chapter 4, that they eat not their bread with idleness, but be ambitious, to work with their hands and so on. And then death ended all, he deals with that. I would not have you ignorant, brethren, concerning them that are fallen asleep. So that's where we are, and Lord willing, we'll try to go right on into it on Wednesday night. I love to study with you, and I hope you love it with all of us together. And that it's faith building, and that you can kind of see in your mind, in your mind's eye, you just kind of see the whole of the New Testament being fit together. I think the weight in incorporating the letters into Acts helps us to do that. Comment or question? Anybody? All right.